Get going. Hi and welcome. We're so excited to have you here today for our webinar on measuring e-bike impact in the US, where we're going to be giving a tutorial of our new tool. So we have a couple reasons for gathering today. The most important one is we wanted to have the opportunity to demonstrate our e-bike environment and economics impact assessment calculator with all of you. We'll plan to go through the functionality of that tool and describe the various planning scenarios. We'll also have opportunities to discuss using that data produced by the calculator. And we're going to have ample time for answering any questions that you have about the scenarios, calculations, how to use it. And at the end, we are hoping to collect ideas and insight from you all to help us expand the functionality of the calculator and the usefulness of it. So we're going to have a quick background presentation. We'll go into the demonstration, we'll have Q&A, and then we will close out with a survey. I'm Heather House. I'm a manager on our carbon-free transportation team, and I'm joined with two of my colleagues, Bryn Grunwald and Jacob Korn, who are also going to be presenting today. And we're also joined by a couple of our other colleagues who you won't see presenting, but have been also instrumental into launching this calculator. Ellen Kennedy, principal on carbon-free transportation, and Amelia Ten, our program marketer. So if you are not familiar with RMI, I just wanted to give a quick overview of our organization. Our mission is to transform the global energy system to secure a clean, prosperous, zero carbon future for all. We do have a bold strategy, which is hitting the 1.5 degrees C scenario in the Paris Climate Accord, which means we are aiming to reduce carbon emissions by 50% by 2030. If we're going to get there, that means that we need to be working across all sectors, transportation, which is what we're focused on today, but also buildings, electricity, and industry. And we need to be using all potential market catalysts, including data and transparency, policy, finance, things that we're talking about today, but also exploring new business models, technology innovations, and providing education and capacity building. We work with cities. We've probably worked with many of you across the US, China, and India, and developing economies. So why did we create this e-bike impact assessment calculator? We really wanted to be able to demonstrate the potential of e-bikes to meet transportation emission reduction goals. We know that if we are going to stay aligned with the 1.5 degrees C scenario, we need to electrify everything, but we also need to cut vehicle miles traveled by 20% by 2030. We know that there are complementary VMT reduction strategies to get there. That includes mode shift and it includes land use reform. Both are going to be essential. We also know that e-bikes have been a proven climate solution. We've seen them growing in popularity. However, we also know that decision makers sometimes lack the data that you may need to make a compelling argument for shifting your investments to more active transportation infrastructure. With that, I'm going to pass it over to my colleague, Jacob.
Thanks, Heather. So with this slide, we wanted to provide a little bit more background on kind of the idea behind the creation of this calculator. And critically, we want to kind of highlight that e-bikes really have this critical mode shift potential. So we know in this country that we get into our cars frequently, and more often than not, they're for short distances, whether you're in kind of our densest cities or some of our more sprawling ones. You can see in the chart on the right that about half of passenger vehicle trips are shorter than 5 miles, and typically up to about 75% are under 10 miles. And so the focus of the calculator was really to try to demonstrate the critical potential that exists with shifting these relatively short vehicle trips over to e-bikes. And we really don't want to make the argument that we're trying to kind of make everyone get rid of their cars and replace vehicles, but instead really just show the potential that exists from shifting a portion of these trips that we're currently taking in vehicles over to e-bikes. So you can see some of the figures on this slide from what we were able to produce with the calculator of what reducing just a quarter of these vehicle trips under 5 miles in the 10 most populous cities in the United States would be. And so we'll share the slides, so I won't go through each one, but you can see really tremendous potential for economic and both climate emissions savings through this. And so one of the biggest e-bike stories that came out from the past few years has been just down in Denver. A fair number of our team is located in Boulder, so we've been fortunate to be able to connect with a number of these folks and really learn about how successful and what they are able to do there with their incentive program. And so this program, if folks haven't heard of it, was launched back in 2022 and was immensely popular with rebates typically being claimed within just kind of 5 to 10 minutes of when they were being released. And since this program launched, it's become a model for the country, with new incentive programs now being replicated in states and cities really across the country. And so Denver surveyed participants about 9 months after the program launched, and you can see that 71% of participants reported using their vehicle less. So this really gave credence to our mode shift argument. And through this, we're able to try to take some kind of real world data that Denver provided all of us. And that, as Bryn will show very shortly, is what really allowed us to build up this calculator. And again, kind of showing some figures here that over 10 years, we could reasonably expect about a 10% VMT reduction, and then pretty significant carbon emissions reductions, as well as fuel and maintenance savings per person that would result just from reduced vehicle miles traveled. And so the kind of last point that I want to get into with these next two slides is also just the potential and importance of e-bikes to promote more equitable mobility for all people through reducing our transportation costs and then also reducing pollution as well. So this is important really in this country just due to the increasing costs of vehicle ownership. From 22 to 23, we saw a 13% just year-over-year increase in the costs of vehicle ownership. A lot of this being due to kind of increased interest rates, rising inflation that just increased costs for folks across the country. And then the second point here is as folks are kind of well aware of, is just the continued negative historical impacts of highway construction that have led to just much higher kind of rates of negative air quality in both poorer as well as Black neighborhoods across the United States. And so we really are able to see that e-bikes are able to kind of get at these key metrics of improving mobility and access for folks. And this is with folks in kind of multifamily housing, as well as carless and transit dependent households. And then getting at this access argument in Denver through the survey that I mentioned on the previous slide, we saw that income qualified recipients simply biked more per week and significantly more, with 50% more miles being traveled than the market rate customers in the program. This being significant in that it, again, gives us some evidence to see that folks who may not have kind of as reliable transportation options are able to use e-bikes to really fill gaps that they have, whether it be from inadequate transit or kind of not consistent access to a vehicle at home. And then here on this final slide, before I pass it back to Heather, is just to drill down a little bit more on kind of another one of these added benefits that come from e-bikes, and this to look at the potential for lowering housing development costs. Across the country, we've seen a lot more cities begin to look seriously at changing or simply eliminating parking minimums as a method both to address climate change and also to reduce costs for folks. Parking minimums, they typically increase construction costs, and then they will also oftentimes enable this dependency for folks on a single occupancy vehicle or a car as well. And so by removing them, we're able to reduce costs for folks, kind of reduce rents and reduce simply housing costs for all people. And then by introducing e-bikes, so kind of partnering these policy changes with e-bike rebate programs or something similar to that, we're able to still provide important access and mobility for folks. So ensure that this does not result in folks having a harder time getting to work or getting to school. And then this report that's flagged from NREL as well shows that e-bikes can really help bridge these transportation gaps, especially for low-income workers. And so an important point just to be made here is kind of this side added benefit from improving e-bike access for folks.
Thank you, Jacob. Okay, we want to talk a little bit about the two scenarios of the calculator before we dive into the demo. One is what we're calling a city mode shift goal, and the second is looking at e-bike incentive programs. So on the first scenario, city mode shift goal, which you're also going to hear Bryn as she does the demo talk about it as a citywide goal. This particular scenario estimates the impact of shifting a percent of passenger vehicle trips to e-bikes. There's two scenario planning options within that scenario that includes a gradual replacement over 10 years and one that has immediate adoption. I just kind of want to like pause and bring attention to this piece because we think it's really important. We included this into the calculator so that you could visualize the impact difference between driving fast change and a slower change. We recognize that the gradual replacement is probably going to be more realistic, but we also know that having both those scenarios can help you make the case for making those investments in e-bike incentive programs or connected protected bike lanes and other infrastructure. Because when you can see that difference in the impact of if we were to be able to shift these trips now versus later, it's a massive, massive difference. So that's scenario one. Scenario two is looking at e-bike incentive programs. This scenario estimates the environmental and economic impact of e-bike programs. And you can test out varying levels of incentive amounts for market rate, or income qualified, and also for different bike types. So looking at commuting bikes or cargo bikes. Both of these scenarios are measuring potential only. I want to sort of point that out. These are really meant to provide stakeholders like yourselves, advocates, cities, and others, the data that you would need to justify investments, as I was mentioning earlier, in e-bike rebate programs and bicycle infrastructure. So we're hoping that this can help support you and your work on the ground. With that, I'm going to pass it over to Bryn to kick us off on the demo.
Thank you. Give me a second to share my screen. If anyone has any questions during the demo, please feel free to put them in the chat. We'll address them during the Q&A session. All right, so we're going to start on the introduction tab. So if you can see down here, there's a bunch of different tabs in different color coding. So this is sort of meant to guide you with the different things you can do on each tab. This bright blue here is the user inputs, which we'll get to in a second. That's where you'll actually select your scenario and put in your specific situation. The outputs tabs are here in dark blue. We have studies and resources in this teal. This light blue here is the tab index, which contains a description of every tab as well as the data that is used on that tab. So if you have a question about our sourcing, for example, or what resources we use, you can go to this tab index here to find what data we used for this workbook. All tabs in this light blue are backend calculations, so they're all open for you to look through if you want to check our math or mess with them yourselves. And then there's, at the end of the workbook, tabs in gray, which is all of our data sourcing. So we're currently on this introduction tab here. So it has a number of things to check out before you move into the rest of the workbook. It starts out with a little introduction, then it moves into instructions. Down here, we have acknowledgements for people who verified this calculator. So we did send it to external reviewers before posting this online, as well as a contact if you have any questions. We have a glossary that defines the words that get used in this calculator, such as vehicles, miles traveled, or commuting e-bike. And then we also have assumptions and notes. So if you're using this calculator and you have a question about how we did something or an assumption we made, please come review this. And if you don't see your question answered by this list of assumptions, please feel free to email us and we can then update this to add in any assumptions that we made. So we're going to check out the tab index next. Like I said, this has all of the tabs, again, color coded, so you can tell which one belongs to what category. It has the name of the tab, the description of what that tab does, as well as any data that is included on that tab and a link to that resource. So if you have any questions about the data that we're using, this is the first place to come check to make sure that we're using useful data. So next we'll go to the user inputs tab. So you're going to want to start up here with step 1, which is selecting your location. So I will note that when we started making this calculator, we used data from Replica at the city level. And when we started creating this calculator, until pretty recently, Replica didn't have any city level data for Hawaii or Alaska. So there are currently no Hawaii or Alaska cities in this calculator. That's something we would like to address in the future. So please let us know if you have us, or if you don't see your city in there in general, please let us know and we can make a note of that to add in the future. So you can go here and select your state from this drop-down menu. So you can, for example, pick Illinois, and then the city will pop up with another drop-down menu of all the cities that we have data available for. So when you pick out your city, we'll start by selecting Chicago. This chart here on the right is populated. So it has a breakdown of the miles traveled on a weekly basis in that urban environment. So on a weekly basis in Chicago, roughly 40% of trips taken in a car are between 0 and 3 miles, with a further 16% being between 3 and 5 miles, adding up to 56% total miles being done on a weekly basis that are under 5 miles. It also breaks it down into the 5 to 10 miles, 10 to 25, and then 25 plus. You can then also change pretty easily between states and cities. So if you want to change to a different state, clear out the city that you were looking at and go up here to the state box and select a new state. So we're going to switch over to California, for example, and let's start by looking at Los Angeles. So again, the chart will pop up, and then you can change between all the different cities here. So I'm going to leave this on, let's say San Diego. So the chart will change depending on the data that we have available. So once you've selected your location, you can come down here to step 2. This is where you're going to select your scenario. So like Heather said in the presentation, we have 2 scenarios for you to select from. The citywide goal, which as Heather said, is our vehicle mode shift goal, and then your e-bike incentive goal. All of these boxes, by the way, are set up in a similar format. So there'll be a description of what this variable is, a unit, and then our default value. So anything in these gray boxes here, if you don't select anything for this green box, the calculator will pull on this box. You can then change out things in the user input box here in green, and then descriptions are available in this light blue box. Please note that right now the calculator is only capable of running either a e-bike incentive program or this vehicle mode shift program at one time. We haven't yet made them be something that can be overlapped. So you can only look at an e-bike incentive program or at this citywide VMT or citywide mode shift goal. So you can come down here and select which one you're interested in. We're going to just leave it on the citywide goal for now, and we'll come back and explore the e-bike incentive program in a minute. So once you've selected your goal, come down here to step 3, which is your vehicle market and city demographics. You'll want to start by checking out your population, looking at your population growth, and the percent of electric vehicles that are registered to your city. Please note that for these 2, this is actually pulling from a statewide number. So the data source that I found anticipated that California was going to grow by 0.8% over every year. So if that is not the case for your region, please update that, because the mileage and the amount of miles traveled actually does depend on the population, as well as this electric vehicle percentage. So if you think, well, I know that there's many more vehicles than that are EV in the city, it's 10% actually, you can update that here. Then we also have our EV policy scenarios. This is largely to show how e-bikes can complement ongoing vehicle electrification. So there's three different scenarios that you can pick between. There's the business as usual scenario, which projects that 9% of all vehicles will be EVs by 2030. And then there's the much more aggressive 1.5-degree aligned scenario, which projects that 29% of all vehicles will be EVs by 2030. So you can pull from those here. And again, that will change things like emissions and everything down the line. But we're going to leave it on the default for now, which is this mid-EV growth, which is assuming it's an average between the other two. And it's basically assuming that 19% of all vehicles will be EVs by 2030. Once you're comfortable with everything here, come down to step 4. So this is step 4A, and this is your citywide mode shift selection. So like Heather said, you can either look at gradual adoption or immediate adoption. We're going to leave this on immediate adoption or on gradual adoption for right now. Then we have broken the calculator out into the 0 to 3 miles and then the 3 to 5 miles. We selected having the calculator allow you to replace vehicle trips up to 5 miles because research has indicated that with e-bikes, people bike a lot farther, and on average, it's roughly 5 miles per trip. So you can check out here, the default is set to 25% of these short trips between 0 and 3 miles being replaced with an e-bike in 10 years and 10% for 3 to 5. If you're curious what number to pick, for example, you can leave it on the default, or you can come up here and look at your chart for your city to think, well, what's reasonable? So this is assuming that 25% of this 30% of total trips will be taken by an e-bike, and then 10% of this 14. So that's easily able to change out, but we're going to just leave it on that default for now. Once you have everything that you're comfortable with, you can go to this citywide goal outputs tab. So it will pop up here with a reconfirmation of all the variables you selected. So with this tab, one of the things we really hope that it can convey is I think everybody on this call is doing great work. We're all probably pretty enthusiastic about e-bikes and the potential that they have. So we really wanted to make the data hopefully useful and clear in order to help you talk to stakeholders or other people who might want to see these charts, these data points. These charts are all made so you can very easily screenshot them and put them into PowerPoints. And we also provide equivalencies as well. So for example, let's go down to this greenhouse gas emissions. This gray bar here is a business as usual emission scenario. So by business as usual, I mean that we're assuming that people are going to continue driving those miles rather than taking a bike. So this blue bar here is they choose to bike this. And please note, we did use data from NREL here as well. So for NREL, we used the forecast for how the grid would change. This is on a statewide level. So for example, we looked at NREL's assumptions for California for the up through 2035, and then drew the conclusions from there on how this would help impact decarbonization. So if you're looking at this, you can see that with the data we have selected, then vehicle emission CO2 would drop by 16%, which is the equivalent of saving 2,300 barrels of oil a week. We also linked to a study here done by NREL that looks at the operational emissions of gas vehicles, which can provide some additional resources for understanding the impact of EVs. Next, we move into the air quality section. So the air quality section looks at 3 different air pollutants. We look at PM 2.5 particulate matter, which is primarily caused by combustion, but also wear from tires and brake pads. We also look at nitrous oxide and carbon monoxide, and then we calculate how much lower that would be from continuing to drive those miles. Obviously, electrification will help get rid of a lot of these things, but moving to an e-bike will produce even less particulate matter, for example. Down here, we also look at VMT reduction. So vehicle miles traveled and how much this would reduce over time. So as you can see here, overall, these short trips would decline by 16% by year 5 as compared to business as usual. And it would reduce all VMT from your selected area by 1.7%. And the thing that we wanted to make clear with this chart is currently an e-bike is more likely to replace a trip that is being taken with a gas car than with an EV. So e-bikes are very complementary in getting electrification to progress much more rapidly and helping meet climate goals. We also have an economics impact. So we didn't look at the upfront cost of vehicles because that got quite challenging with the cars as well. But we did look at the difference between fuel and maintenance. We do assume a maintenance value for e-bikes that is on our assumptions tab. And we also assume that people are replacing their battery every 4th year. So in the 4th and 8th year of bike ownership, people are getting a new battery. However, even with that cost, people are still saving roughly 8% of the value of over continuing to drive, which is on average $237 a year in San Diego just from replacing fuel and maintenance costs. If you're curious about what values we used, again, this is all in our assumptions and our data notes for the calculator. We also have this detailed impacts of vehicle trip replacement table. So we calculate the total number of miles reduced, the amount of CO2 saved, the total saved per person, gallons of gas replaced, and then megawatt hours reduced from using e-bikes over EVs. And these charts update quite easily. So let's say you're looking at your chart and you say, well, I really believe that San Diego will be able to actually replace 1/3 of all their short trips between 0 and 3 miles with an e-bike. You can come here and you can type in, for example, 33%. Then when you go back here, the chart will have automatically updated to fit your goal. So this has now gone up from 16% CO2 savings to 20%. You can see here that there is a further reduction in VMT. So it's very easy to play around with different scenarios to see what you feel comfortable with. And then if you also say, well, I want to see 10 years out is great, but I want to see what would happen now, you can come back to this user inputs tab, select this drop down and go to immediate adoption. That will then say, all right, we drop these number of trips tomorrow. And this updates to look at the year 1 reductions in CO2. So as you can see here, it would change very drastically with the amount of miles that people are driving, the amount of money that they are saving, as well as the amount saved per person, the total gallons of gas, and the metric tons reduced overall. So now we're going to go shift and look at, I'm going to leave this on 10%. We're going to shift and look at our e-bike incentive program. So you would come down here to step 4B. So the e-bike incentive program has a lot of defaults that are set to resemble Denver's. This is largely to help guide you in establishing your own variables for a program. So you can put in, for example, your total budget, the timeline, as well as your different incentive rates. So we do follow Denver in providing, for example, different abilities to set different incentives by bike type. So commuting bikes, which are often less expensive, but more like a regular bike with a battery, and then cargo bikes, which are often more expensive, but are capable of hauling much more weight. You can then change this out by income qualified versus market rate. So Denver defined their market rate participants as people who made 80% or the market rate participants as people who made over 80% of the area median income. So you can take a look and determine if this is something you want to do. You can also then set the percentage of incentives that are being set aside for the income qualified participants, and then income qualified incentives for commuting rebates versus market rate commuting bike rebates. You can then also look at the average miles biked. Again, this is something that you can change it out, and if you are unsure, you can leave it in on the default that it is currently set to. With Denver, they sent out a study at the end of the first year of their program or a survey to see how people were actually using their bikes. Market rate customers reported biking an average of 22 miles a week, while income qualified participants reported biking an average of 32 miles a week. So we wanted to give people the opportunity to look at how this could play out in their own community. Once you've selected everything that you want, you can come here to this program outputs tab, or to the incentive program outputs tab. It puts everything into a little table, so you can very easily snip this out and put it into a PowerPoint or just see what you selected in this scenario. Likewise, with the other page, we have a greenhouse gas emissions tab that looks at emissions savings. We look at, again, air quality, total VMT reductions, and economic impact. So unlike the citywide incentive program or the citywide VMT trip replacement, this one we're looking at an individual level. So again, this does assume battery purchasing happening in the 4th and 8th year of ownership. So, but this program estimates that across people who participate in this program with the defaults that we have set up, people would be saving on average around $1,800 just through avoiding fuel and maintenance costs. We also have tabs that or charts here that show the estimated number of incentives given out by income qualified versus market rate, as well as the different types of bike that you would potentially see. We also, again, have this incentive program out impacts table, which looks at personal VMT reduction, the total reduction per bike, pounds of CO2 saved per dollar spent on the program, total savings per person, and total megawatt hours avoided. Again, this is meant to be very easy to change out. So if you're looking at this and you say, well, this seems like a really low number of income qualified rebates, for example, I really want to make sure that, let's say 75% of the total rebates are available for low income participants, you can go here and put that in. And then you can go back to your program outputs tab and you can see here how all these numbers change. So for example, because we make the assumption that low-income participants would bike a lot more than market rate customers, you see average savings go up, as well as total VMT. And then that also reflects here, individual VMT reduction would jump to an average of 11% among all participants, with a total CO2 savings of 3.3 metric tons per e-bike and over 5 million gallons of gas. Again, this is meant to sort of provide estimations and data. It's a way to sort of compare a potential to the baseline scenario. All our data is open for you to go through and look. So if you're curious about our assumed efficiency rates for the different vehicles, we do have all of that available in the calculator for you to look through if you're curious. The calculator is locked, but if you are curious and playing around with the calculations, please email me and I can let you know how to unlock it so you can play with the calculations yourself. So if you're curious as well for other data and resources to back up your goals with these programs, we did assemble this studies and resources tab. So there's a lot of great qualitative data to support adoption of e-bikes more broadly, but there wasn't anything that we currently felt comfortable using in a more detailed quantitative way. So we did decide to collect some of these studies to help back up the case for e-bikes. We have this study here about how e-bikes can help reduce traffic congestion and improve commute times, how e-bikes can help people meet exercise goals by qualifying as moderate to intense exercise. People who get e-bikes are more than double their use of bikes for transportation. Bikes can often improve economic opportunities, especially if there's solid infrastructure to support their use, and that e-bikes can potentially help reduce noise pollution in cities. We also collected some best practice guides to help guide infrastructure development, such as safe lane design principles and best practices in shared micromobility parking. We also found some useful case studies and resources for e-bike incentive programs, such as People for Bikes electric bicycle incentive toolkit. So this is really meant to help provide additional value to anything that you might have a question about with e-bikes. Thank you all for the time.